Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thank you to the hosts and organizers of KIBS. I really appreciate the opportunity to present a few slides today just around safety and some of the work Icomia is doing, hopefully. There we go. So a very quick introduction around Icomia, International Council of Marine Industry Associations. We're a global organization. The term is we considered the global voice for the marine industry. You will hear a lot about Icomia and some of the work and activities within the association throughout today. So I encourage you to listen to our CEO, Joe Lynch, and our Asia representative, Su-Lin Chi as well, will be explaining in more detail. I just wanted to add this slide to give a bit of background. A lot of our work is really around collaboration, research, and advocacy. We try and maintain a global harmonized approach, and what that means really is not to create too much divergence and create level playing fields or level markets. Just very quickly, my background, so you get an understanding of where my talk and presentation comes from. It's not just Icomia, it's my experience of the last sort of 50 years. To explain the photo on the right, that's my father's yacht, both designed and built. It's a 50-foot ferro cement boat. So that picture was taken in Cape Town just before the 1976 Cape Town to Rio yacht race. And I was 3 years old, so that was my first experience in yachting. But my background has been both on the sailing side, so working professionally, but also as a yacht designer and getting to understand how production happens in various boatyards around the world. And like many of you sitting here today, I've been on that side of the fence trying to understand some of the things you need to comply with, some of the standards, some of the processes you have to keep. So I totally understand from that aspect how complicated some of these structures are. This really just explains where we are today. The boating industry is under change. The actual picture you're seeing there is something that's very much unregulated, meaning there are no certain types of rules for these types of craft. And what we're going to be discussing today, both in this speech and in the panel discussion, is we know that change is coming. We know that there's big advancements in technology. This is a remote-controlled electric towing vehicle. We know that this is all coming. How can we prepare ourselves? Because legislation isn't always in place and standards aren't always in place for these things. This is just a quick comparison. These are the two big markets that impact small craft and the legislation around small craft. On the left-hand side is really the European model. So we have the Recreational Craft Directive. That's the legal text that governs both small craft, recreational small craft, and personal watercraft, as well as a couple of components and things like that. There's some essential requirements in the RCD, and we'll get into that a bit later during this presentation. Effectively, you may have heard about the CE mark, that labeling structure. That really shows that the product which is CE marked is in conformity with the Recreational Craft Directive. That may apply to a component like a port light or a hatch as well. So you may find components individually CE marked. And there's a declaration of conformity attached to that, but we don't have to get into those details. To meet the essential requirements in the Recreational Craft Directive, we got a whole bunch of you've heard ISO standards, and these are ISO standards for small craft. The wording there is harmonized standards, which means effectively, the regular ISO standards become European standards, and the harmonized bit is just that they are, the technical term is provide a presumption of conformity. And what that means is if you can use these harmonized standards, you meet the requirements in the essential, the essential requirements in the RCD. On the right is just a comparison with the market in the US. It is very different. There's the Code of Federal Regulations. Today, we're not going to cover too much around the US market, but if people are interested in that, we can explain. On the left is, on the RCD side, there are a lot more requirements than there are in the US, for example. So we'd cover the EU side first. Just quickly, you can see there are some gaps. So the American system doesn't necessarily use ISO standards. They use ABYC standards. But there, I'll get into right at the end of my presentation, there is alignment between those two sets of standards. We try, and going back to the harmonized process, we try and get those requirements as equal as possible, so you can effectively meet them both in the US and in the EU. This covers the main requirements that are stipulated in the RCD. So these are the absolute, you have to meet these requirements. Now, with European legislation, it is quite tricky. A lot of the technical details are not included in this terminology. So you can see, for example, I just outlined the scope. So we're talking about craft really from 2.5 meters to 24 meters. It does include personal watercraft, less than 4 meters, and then it does cover some components, not all components, or marine-related components. There is a list. I think the main highlight here, and I've tried to include that in the text that comes out, is to not endanger the health and safety of persons, property, or the environment. And there's the intended purpose. So what that means really is a very broad statement to the manufacturer that you have to try and make sure you are not endangering the health and safety. Below that really is just a whole other list. There's obligations of what we term economic operators. You'll hear from Alistair Ray a bit later, who is a notified body, meaning they are on the screen there, that would be part of the conformity assessment bodies. And the bottom part of the slide is really the critical essential requirements. And we don't really have enough time during this session, but I'm happy to explain anytime this, the coming few days at the boat show, we can go into more details. But effectively, this terminology is setting what you see on your screen. So if we just use an example around structural hull integrity and the like, we have stability and freeboard, we have buoyancy and flotation, we have things like opening, floodings covered. What it doesn't cover, and you'll see there a little bit further along, are these safety equipment requirements. So really what the RCD is doing, it's aimed at the manufacturer of the product and when he places it on the market. What it doesn't cover is that in-use phase of a boat's lifetime. So for example, the requirements are there to include a position or a storage facility for a life raft, but it doesn't do is cover what size that life raft necessarily needs to be, or where exactly it's located, or some of the differences there. Things like how many life jackets need to be carried on board. We find globally, there are a lot of differences there. So on the safety equipment side, there are still some additional requirements that that may cover in certain countries. This RCD really is the manufacturer, because he's not always sure where his craft may end up being used, and therefore can't assume what type of equipment's on board. But there are things that cover certain requirements, like the life raft stowage. There's obviously requirements around nav lights, which are international. They're basically governed by the coal regs, and that applies to all shipping. So that's all incorporated in. And then finally, that's on the craft side. There are some requirements around exhaust emissions and also noise emissions. So there is quite a big section. There's a pass-by noise test, as well as obviously on the exhaust side, there are engine emission test cycles stipulated. Those are harmonized with the requirements under EPA in the US. So a manufacturer, as you may well be aware, making, for example, at the show, someone like Honda or Suzuki would be making an engine, that product would be allowed. The emission limits would be incorporated both in EU and US. I've mentioned the recreational craft requirements. How do we meet those? Because that's the interesting bit here. You may have heard about ISO standards, so international standards. This is this is just off their website. You can gain a lot of information. This is ISO TC 188 for small craft. So going back to the scope, that's still below 24 meters. And the next couple of slides will cover some of these ISO standards, because these are one way. They're not a mandatory way. You don't have to use the ISO standards. But what we always try and explain is that by using these standards, you know that you are meeting the minimum safety level requirements. These have been used for a number of years. They're revised. ISO standards are typically revised or looked at every 5 years. So they might not be right up there with the highest level of technology, but they've had some incorporation in their development, and they've had some feedback, and people who've used them have provided that feedback. So I don't want to go into too many details of specific standards. I just want to mention a couple here to give you an example of the work that happens within ISO TC 188. Icomia plays an important role. We support the Secretariat of the ISO TC committee, both financially but also helping organize and getting working groups together and liaison work. We don't have a ballot or a vote ourselves. Those are left up to the national standards bodies. On your screen are really a list. We don't have to cover these individually, but I just wanted to mention some of these standards today to show what the type of work is that is going on. Lithium-ion batteries clearly is one area of focus within our market. We're seeing more of their use both as a propulsion energy storage system, but also as a house bank, so an onboard battery bank. And it's important that those get covered. Electric propulsion systems. This standard was first started in 2015, and it's obviously changed a lot. So this is one of those standards that really needs revising. The other two I'd like to mention are quite relative to this audience in that there were two standards proposed by CATS. CATS is the national standards body in Korea. So that would be the organization. Icomia is just a liaison, but the actual participating members, like CATS, can propose new work items. And there's two new work items that have been proposed there. And they are very relevant today. They cover AC/DC shore charging systems, and there's also one around the actual installation of some of these electric drive propulsion systems. The new proposals that are coming through, we've had a lot of discussion around the use of hydrogen on board as an alternative propulsion fuel or in a fuel cell system. And there's a significant interest around how hydrogen is stored safely on board. And then finally, just to mention, there is another proposal from Sweden, and you may have heard of the manufacturer Candela. They make fully electric hydrofoiling boats in Sweden. They are proposing a sort of method to assess the energy consumption of a small craft. In effect, that works kind of back into this life cycle assessment process, where the full life cycle of a boat is analyzed, right from all the materials and the materials in the components all put together throughout the build phase and the use phase and also the end of life phase. So that'll be a very important standard to cover. And just to follow on from ISO standards, so it's very difficult to cover all of these in this session. I just wanted to mention some of the activities, and this is something, there's cross correspondence between other ISO technical committees as well. So what we find, whilst we focused on the small craft side and developing standards to meet the essential requirements of the RCD, there are other ISO standards. In fact, there's a number of other ISO standards that keep me very busy. The one I'd like to mention here, this is a cross-development with a totally separate technical committee. It's number 22, subcommittee 41. But what they deal with there really is both CNG and LNG propulsion systems. And what they're looking at, they're developing the standard within their own technical committee, but they'd like some input over some of the safety and, well, the installation and then some of the safety concerns around fitting LNG, so gas propulsion systems on board a small craft. So there would be a joint working group effectively between the two technical committees. They would be in charge of the technical details relating to the actual propulsion system, but there would be input from the technical committee, from the small craft technical committee about how to achieve that. One other thing we try and do with standards development is clearly we need engagement of experts, those in the field who are actually producing and manufacturing small craft to gain their knowledge and input. ISO is quite a difficult, it tends to be quite a lot of admin attached to it and how to register and participate. We help with that process, and we also help develop a sort of improvement list. It's an informal list coming from industry members globally around some of the challenges they may be facing in understanding some of the standards. So one way is for me to do my job is to incorporate all these changes or grey areas which aren't clear and bring that back to when a standard is revised, to understand that industry they're having a problem understanding the standard or using the standard because of certain bits of information that may not be included or may not be clear. So on your right-hand side is something Icomia produces. It's a very basic standards bulletin, and it just lists some of the standards in there that are under revision. It helps you gain an idea of what future revisions may be needed. Now, one thing that is happening at the moment is we're also undergoing a potential change to the actual recreational craft directive. This will happen not within 1 or 2 years. It won't happen very quickly. That process will take 6 or 7 years, so there's no immediate change. But clearly we need to have some form of preparing the ISO standards to try and meet some of these new requirements. So it goes back to that first slide around change. There's a lot, there's never a time or a process we can say, okay, this is everything you need to cover and it's going to stay like that for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. You have to carefully monitor what those changes, they may not be immediate, they may be upcoming, but part of my role within Icomia is to try and get that message out that in 2 or 3 years' time we may be facing certain changes. The last bit is really beyond the bulletin. There are a set, the way ISO works, they hold traditionally 3 times per year there are meetings. Now we fully realize a global organization is quite difficult to get into one room. So a lot of those meetings are hybrid style. There is almost always a virtual connection to those meetings. And I can help explain if there are people here today that would like to participate in ISO standards work, which is quite interesting because it gives you a feel for some of the challenges. I'm happy to help with that. Our next set of meetings is coming up in June in the UK. This slide really is about some of the guidance beyond just the standards bulletin and working with our members. Clearly there are certain safety aspects we need to consider. Before my time at Icomia, they've started sort of these global compliance guidelines. And what these help to achieve, really, there's 9 different guidelines there, and they cover quite key areas. Fuel, LPG, electrical, man overboard. All of these things are quite key topics that the RCD covers. What these conformity guidelines help to achieve is they look at what are the requirements that you need from the ISO standards, so more based on a European style compliance, and they compare them across to ABYC standards in the US as well. So there's a cross matrix over what are the requirements and really what are the differences. What do you need to be aware of that may be different in the US versus in Europe? We know, for example, in the US, things like stability and buoyancy are not covered in any great detail. And the same with sort of structural, what we term scantlings, which scantlings really are structural measurements or equations that work out how your structure is going to perform. Things like that aren't always analyzed in the US. So it makes a comparison around all those topics that a lot of manufacturers have challenges with. And then this is my final slide, and really I hope you can understand the picture there, and it might need a bit of explaining. We understand that a lot of manufacturers, boat builders, yacht designers, component manufacturers have a lot of challenges. I've mentioned today the Recreational Craft Directive, but there are a lot of other EU regulations that cover small craft as well, meaning there are certain directives that cover things like cybersecurity now is a good example. It's a separate directive or regulation, but it's something boat builders need to become more familiar with. if you're not in scope of the RCD, there's also hold or catching directives. So there's a general product safety directive in the EU that really protects the end user. So if you feel that you're not in scope of certain bits of legislation there are catch-all directives that help with understanding some of the other product safety things. The photo, to explain it, is to say, this photo, you have to put a fire extinguisher there on this building. What it's about is you don't necessarily, you can adjust the surroundings things. So you're meeting the requirement of having your fire extinguisher there. But you are going a step further and you're creating a bit more of a graphic. In this case, it's a funner example. So safety is one way, the safety requirements, you kind of have to meet. And that's your baseline, but you can go beyond that. Alistair will probably talk in the panel discussion coming up now in a little bit more detail of some of these recreational craft directive requirements. But once that baseline is set and you've done a sort of risk assessment, you've covered things in your technical file and some of the things that are worded in the essential requirements, you can go beyond that. Yeah, and this is going beyond that. This is now turning what was a fire extinguisher into a bit of artwork in an office. And lastly, we know we're going to have to enable this continuous improvement. We don't want to stop this growth of technology, but we're always aware of some of these safety requirements that do need to be met. And they work hand in hand. Hopefully you've managed to understand most of the messaging and slides today. I'm around for the next 3 days and really happy to try and answer any additional questions that anyone has.
Patrick, thank you.